Hey, how's it going? Welcome to this Dev Chats live stream. My name is Matt Ling. I'm a developer advocate at Stripe based out of Europe. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Jan Jaworski, a React native developer at CallStack, and Mike Bifulco, who's a colleague of mine. Mike, would you like to start with the intros?
Yeah, hey there, Matt. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I guess wherever you're hanging out with us from. Yeah, my name is Mike Bifulco. I'm a developer advocate here at Stripe, and I've been on board for a while now, kind of working on mobile stuff and creator economy, founder related content for Stripe, education for anything related to that. All of our Twitter handles are next to our name. Feel free to drop us a line at any point, and we'll do our best to pay attention to chat during the stream today. And I guess that leaves Jan. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Jan. I'm React and React Native developer at CallStack. I worked on web apps and also React Native SDKs, integration exposing native libraries so that they can be used on React Native.
Super cool. Yeah, I'm really thrilled to. I'm going to be doing a little bit of looking at questions that might come up in the chat, but certainly I'm going to be learning loads. I'm like really happy about that as well, because like I'm kind of new to React. I'm certainly very new to React Native. So yeah, I'm really excited about this stream. So Jan, maybe you could tell us, like, start by telling us like a little bit of your history as a developer. I think I'm curious, like, were you kind of a front end developer that came to kind of to React and React Native, or were you like a mobile developer like that transitioned over into kind of like this technology for writing once one code base and like deploying to lots of different targets?
Sure. So I started programming around 4 years ago. I was supposed to program in .NET and Angular, but the project that I got was written in React, and I started learning it, and I really liked it. It was fresh, easy to pick up and dive into. And later on, when we had a project to create a mobile app, we had a discussion whether we should create a native app for Android and iOS, maybe use something like Cordova or Xamarin. But because I knew React and I heard about React Native, I really wanted to try it out. It seemed very exciting. So I was able to convince my employer to try it out. And we created a smart shopping app so people can just go into a store, scan products with their phone, and check out there.
Cool. What an interesting use case. Yeah. So React Native, one of the interesting things about it to me, I guess, is the sort of nature of it being very flexible and cross-platform. I'm interested, so for our audience here, I'm interested kind of in your take on maybe the difference between plain React Native, and then the surfaces that React Native is applicable to.
Sure. So React Native is in many ways similar to React. But it doesn't create a web view when you're developing an app with it. It uses the native components and native views that you would normally develop when creating iOS or Android apps. So the app feels native to the specific platform, and your user won't really notice that there is something different. And for you as a developer, it's much easier because you don't have to really think and to maybe re-implement the same thing twice.
Yeah, and so for people who've built things with React before, is it a fairly similar developer experience? What are maybe the main differences that a developer might need to know about going from React to React Native?
Okay, so the main difference I think is that instead of using elements like div or span or any other HTML element, you will be using something like view, text view. Also, styling is a little bit different because it's not CSS, but it's very much inspired by CSS, so it's easy to pick up, and I would say sometimes even easier to work with because it's a slimmed down version of CSS, and so any web developer should be feeling right at home.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things about this. We'll probably show some code samples later too. If you're familiar with CSS, it'll look like a more mature maybe CSS in some ways, but also different, right? The syntax is a little bit different. But oh, sorry, go ahead, Jan.
Yeah. So also, if you've tried something like CSS in JS, this will be even more familiar to you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's has the benefit of sort of learning from what we've gone through with CSS, having lots of different syntax options and sort of redundancy in the way you can get things done. React Native started from scratch much more recently than CSS did, so they were able to approach it slightly differently. What about the different surfaces that you can compile React Native apps for? Where are the different places that you can deploy to?
So the main two platforms are iOS and Android, but also you can write apps for Windows and even macOS, and different companies are also adapting it for their special needs. For example, you can write apps for TVs and other types of devices.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that. Not knowing too much about how to target those different platforms, but like how much of the complexity does React Native take away? You know, when, for example, let's say I wanted to build an app that targets maybe a mobile, let's say iOS and Android, typical examples, but I also want to deploy it to like Android TV or something like that. Like how much work is it to kind of like to use the correct components on kind of quite disparate displays, let's say, or interfaces?
Yeah, so for from the React Native side, usually it will be very similar. So you will have the component like view that will be then translated into native component for a specific platform, and then with CSS you can write your app to be more responsive. Also, because then the platforms like smartphones and TVs are much different, so you will navigate differently. You may need to sometimes to create a component that you want only to show for specific platform. Then you can use like if statement to check what type of platform it is and display specific version, or even you can create, for example, you can have button.js component, and you can create button.android.js, button.ios.js, and so on. And then React Native will know which one to pick on specific platform.
Okay, so it's possible, but is it kind of like not subclass, but kind of to create specific components for specific platforms, depending on how you interact with them? That's super cool. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so Jan, when you're writing these sort of cross-platform or components, or sorry, platform-specific things, how does it work with native features for platforms? So I guess what I'm thinking of is taking advantage of something like using the camera on iOS versus Android. Are there things you need to do differently for implementation across the two?
Usually it's the same. So the developers write SDKs that expose native APIs through React Native. So the only thing that you usually have to do is install such package from npm, and you're good to go. Sometimes there might be some specific platform requirements or features. Then usually in the documentation you have information that this prop or this feature is only available for a specific platform. And for example, if you don't have React Native package that exposes such API, it's also possible to write it on your own.
Yeah, wow. So it's extremely flexible. I guess along those lines, my next question then is, what does it look like so this is written with JavaScript. First of all, maybe is what's the story with TypeScript? Is it supported? Is it required?
Yes, it's supported, like? But it's not required. You can use JavaScript, TypeScript, or even Flow. I would really recommend picking up TypeScript, at least for apps that are a little bit bigger and are not just hobby apps or experiments. And recently, React Native core repository moved the typings for TypeScript from the community into their main repository. So it's up to date and quite good, I would say.
Yeah, and that can be really powerful in making sure that you're being, type safe and doing all the right things and building your apps. It is, of course, not required, like you said, but definitely a good idea if you're working on a larger project. So then how does that pair with NPM? Because this is all written with JavaScript or TypeScript. Can you use packages from the NPM library for your application as well?
Yes, so you can use like different tools, NPM, Yarn, and so on that you might be familiar when developing web apps. The important distinction is to know that you can only use libraries that are using standard JavaScript API, so no web APIs. I think the closest comparison is with Node.js, where not all packages work with it, and sometimes you have to either have separate package for it or something that makes it compatible. You cannot also use component libraries that are written for React Web. So, for example, if you want to use Material UI, you won't be able to. But instead you can use other component libraries like React Native Paper that we develop at CallStack as an open source project that will work with iOS, Android, and web.
Yeah, what I usually kind of try and look at it as is if you're importing a library that relies directly on web UIs that either manipulate the DOM or take advantage of things like window dot blank, you name it, they won't work in React Native because the what it compiles down to is not something that has all of those DOM functions in necessarily. And if you're able to sort of conceptualize that, you have a pretty good idea of what's available in NPM, which is still a massively broad spread of things, especially in a world where we're starting to get more and more sort of like headless libraries for things like making tables and doing data fetching from APIs and things like that as well.
Yeah, I think good example of library that you can use is Lodash, so it will work without a problem. And there are also libraries like React Query that have bindings and expose specific settings and bindings for React Native and also other platforms. So yeah, you can use these libraries without a problem.
Yeah, what about, do you have any examples of applications or companies that are using React Native to build their apps?
Yes, so I think the biggest one, except for Facebook, which is the main creator of React and React Native, is Microsoft. They are very vocal about their use of React Native, and they also created React Native for Windows and macOS, even though it's not their platform. They are using it in their Office suite, and also they've rewritten their Xbox app from Electron to React Native, and they saw a huge boost in performance. If I'm correct, for example, usage of RAM went from like 300 megabytes to 60. So it's huge difference, and also they can take advantage of native animations. So it's smooth, it's fast, and overall feels like part of the system.
Yeah, it's a big difference. I think the RAM difference likely comes from not having to emulate an entire browser to render the application. You don't have to spin up the whole browser engine.
So I think that this is also important information that even though you write React Native apps in JavaScript, it's only a thin layer of JavaScript that communicates with native APIs. So the performance impact is usually not noticeable or very small compared to like Electron app, where you are basically spinning another instance of Chrome browser.
Yeah, the performance difference is pretty large, and it's there's some comparisons. Maybe I should go and try and find some of those comparisons between like what the animations look like for a native app for a relatively complicated thing versus something that's compiled through a web interface. It's pretty impressive, and makes a big difference if you're working on something like a game that you want to have function normally on a mobile device. Especially too if you're working on, say, an Android phone that might be a few years old, or like an iPhone, I don't know, 10, 11, something like that, that's a few years back, that might not have the same performance as a brand new out of the box iPhone Pro of whatever number we're at now.
Yeah, so maybe a quick info that there are great libraries for React Native, like Reanimated, where you can create really complex animations, and the main benefit is that if you did it on web, it will be much harder to hit stable 60 FPS, and it's quite important. And with this, you can create a lot of very interesting and unique experiences, and there are a lot of tutorials on YouTube and other platforms where they show what you can achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. No shortage of learning for any of this stuff. With that being said, Jan, let's talk a bit about setting up yourself to build with React Native. So let's talk a little bit about what are the tools you use to build with, what are the things you might need to install, what does the developer experience look like?
Okay, so the setup is a little bit more complex than just developing web application, but a lot of tools are similar. So, for example, you will need Node and NPM, but it's a similar experience. And to get started, I would recommend using Expo, which makes the overall setup very easy, and it works similarly to create React app. It shows you what you need. So you will need also Xcode if you are on macOS, and Android Studio for developing Android apps, and also specific emulators. But you can also connect your real device, so you will be able to see how the app runs in the real time.
Yeah, and so the long and short of it is that what's happening is your React code that you're writing is being compiled to the native thing, and so you need to be on a device, be at least able to run an emulator for the thing that you're doing. So macOS is definitely the standout there. If you want to run an iOS, iPad OS, whatever application, you need to be on a Mac so that you can install Xcode tooling so that you can run the emulators to then compile to and run there. But Android Studio and things like that are a little more flexible, right?
Yeah, and also even if you are on like Linux or Windows and you develop the React Native app and you don't have to access to iOS device, you can still your app still will work on it. You will have to maybe build it and send it to someone for testing, but it doesn't block you from developing apps for iOS.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about Expo a little bit. Expo, of course, I guess is, gosh, I don't even know the best way to describe it, but it is an enabler for running and testing React Native apps, and allows you to deploy and test in your devices as well as sort of across a network and things like that. What does the Expo testing process look like?
So you can, for example, install Expo Go app, which will allow you to quickly deploy app to real device, or even someone remotely you can send them a link, and they will be able to download and preview app quickly and give you feedback. So if you have a client and you want to show them a new feature or some QA, then it's the whole process is very streamlined and easy. And other than that, if you want to do testing like in code, you can use just like on the web, or there are also end-to-end solutions that you can use. So Expo is not limiting you in any way.
Yeah, it's quite enabling. The CLI is really useful too, right?
Yes, so with CLI you get a lot of features that usually you would have to do manually. So you can deploy your apps to Google and Apple Store, and I think it also gives you a lot of other helpers to make the whole development process much easier and allow you to iterate quickly.
And with Expo, what's the deployment process like when you're actually targeting different like app stores? For example, I remember back in the day when I was like trying to develop or trying to start out with iOS development, I think the deployment process and the release processes would be quite different. Does Expo kind of give you all of the assets and then you kind of like separately plug them into the different app stores, or does it take care of the submission processes for you, or how does that work?
It takes care of it for you, so
Wow.
you can. It's much easier compared to like going through it yourself. You still have to like register for each store, and you have to pay $100 a year for Apple Store and a single fee for Google Store, which is $25. But other than that, it will submit your app, and then maybe on the Apple Store you will have to fill in some details, but it should be much easier.
Yeah, because I remember that, if I remember correctly, there were some involved processes around certificate management with Apple. Is that kind of still a part of the process where you need to tell Expo, okay, here's my certificate, on those lines?
From what I know, it can even generate this certificate for you. So
okay.
If you have one that you want to use, you can use it, but if you don't, you can easily generate it.
Wow, that's huge. To me, like taking all of that process away from you is like, wow, that's really amazing.
Yeah, so for example, when I work on React Native app without Expo, I remember that setting up a CI was quite a hassle and took a lot of time. And with Expo, you can quite easily plug in your build process on the CI.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah. So Jan, what's the the update process look like? So let's say I've got an app in the app stores and I want to release a new version of my app with a feature added or a feature change or maybe some content changed. How does that work?
Yeah, so compared to web, where you don't have to ask anyone for permission, you can you will have to submit your app and then go through the review process where your app will be checked by a real person, and they will give you feedback, or if everything can go smoothly, your app will be approved. It can take a little bit of time. I was always scared of this process, but so far I was quite lucky, and the whole thing went through smoothly. But it's not unique for React Native apps. This is how publishing apps for smartphones work. But I think the unique benefit of writing React Native apps is that you can also do updates without going through this process. Because if you only need to change something on JavaScript side, so for example, you have a typo or a small bug, you can just change it, rebuild the JavaScript bundle, and then remotely deploy a new bundle. So when users open their app, and then it will download an update, and you won't have bugs that were reported by the users, and they won't even have to go through to the App Store and download it. So you can ensure that all of your users are using latest version. You don't have to wait for the process to that can take sometimes a couple of days. So if it's a critical issue, you don't have to worry as much. You can also maybe deploy some events that, for example, you want to have some kind of Christmas promotion or something like that, and this is possible. And you usually would have to worry that, oh, some users may not see it because they won't update my app, and here it will be available to everyone.
Yeah, I'm curious, like regarding the kind of like submitting updates to an app to to different app stores and things like that, because with my kind of relatively limited exposure, because I was more of a Ruby dev, so I'm kind of more just diving into the whole world of like npm packages and updates. Like, how do you manage, because I find that, like, and generally speaking, depending on which packages you're using, they get updated quite quickly, whereas your release cycle might not be every week or every other week. So how do you manage kind of the speed of updates on the one side of like packages versus kind of like your release rhythms for the apps?
Okay, I think it really depends on what you want to do, because even though npm packages update quite quickly, you don't really have to be always on the bleeding edge, and I think you can take your time. And overall, the most popular open source apps quite well document any breaking changes or things that you have to do to keep your app up to date.
Okay, cool. Yeah, like I tend to, for the projects I manage, okay, I'm obviously looking for the critical stuff, and then breaking changes, but I've never kind of thought about, oh wait, now I have to bake that into kind of like a native kind of deployment flow, if you like. But yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, if it's only on the JavaScript side, then you don't have to like go through the whole submission process. So I think that's a big plus. And with React Native, you can have also quick reload. So just as with normal React, when you change something, add component, it will automatically refresh for you and show you changes.
Cool, really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so Jan, I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, why we're here. One of the interesting things of sort of the purpose of our chat today is to talk about the React Native integration for Stripe and setting up your mobile apps to use Stripe. Probably a good baseline for that conversation is just talking about payments on mobile apps to begin with, because it's a very different world from taking payments on the web, where it's sort of, as long as you can get someone to submit their payment information to you to buy your thing, that's cool. Obviously, there's taxes and regulations and things like that I am not a lawyer, don't take legal advice from me, et cetera, et cetera. I think we'll all probably reiterate that none of us are lawyers, don't take legal or financial advice from us. But with that being said, what do payments on mobile apps look like?
I think there is important distinction that, for example, if you want to process payments for in-app purchases, whether it's a mobile game with microtransactions or maybe some add-ons, or you want to go through subscription like Netflix, then you will have to go through the Apple payment or Google payment, because they take their share from it. But for example, if you have e-commerce or any service that is not tied to your application, then you can integrate quite easily with Stripe. So what you will have to do is set up backend and install npm package that Stripe has published, and then you should be good to go.
Yeah, and so the payments ecosystem is one of those things where, as a traditional web developer, sort of where I live, it's not something that I had known a ton about before coming into the world of building mobile apps. And that distinction between digital and physical goods is an important one. The digital goods have to go through I guess I would call it the native app store. If you're on an iOS device, the digital purchases like subscriptions need to go through Apple's store and their purchase process. And if you're on a Google device, the digital purchases need to go through there. And physical goods, services, things like that don't have to go through their purchase system. And I guess that's probably where something like this comes in. So let's talk about that a little bit more. I guess, what's the value proposition of using something like Stripe versus Apple's tools versus Google's tools for collecting payments when those are seemingly already built into the native experience for those?
Okay, so I think that the main advantage is that you can you will have a lot of payment options. So you can integrate credit cards, debit cards. Also, you can integrate with pay later services or bank accounts, vouchers, even Apple Pay and Google Pay, and it's all in one package. So when you set it up through Stripe, you can just then decide what options are good for you. And with other solutions, maybe you would have to go through process of adding it for every option. So it will take development time. You will have to probably do more bug fixing and also keeping up to date maybe additional work. And here, if something new is available, you can just toggle the switch and it will be available for users. And when they have a lot of options, they are more likely to go through with the purchase because they can pick something that is the most convenient for them.
Yeah, I think that's something that I harp on a lot about, especially in you know, in the European region, that it's, you know, as opposed to like cards, which are, you know, extremely popular in the US, in Europe, you know, SEPA debit is a very popular payment method in Germany. Klarna, you know, things like Ideal. So it's really important to be able to offer those local payment methods to those to the folks you're selling to in that kind of like fragmented payments landscape, because it will ultimately lead to increased conversion, which is, you know, leading to revenue, right? So the fact that you can like just basically switch things on and off as you see fit in the SDK is pretty awesome.
Yeah, and maybe one more thing is that, for example, you will first deploy your app in one country, whether it's Germany, UK, or anywhere else, and then you will want to open your services to markets in the US or Asia, and you won't have to think about any regulatory issues or additional setup needed for them, because Stripe already took care of it. So whether it's taxes or regulations, it should be quite easy process to open up to new markets.
Yeah, there's a load of other benefits that you get as well from plugging into Stripe. Obviously, I think the primary benefit there is that you as the person building the app, you want to connect your users to purchases as quickly as possible to get out of the way of them, you know, making the decision not to buy things. So giving them the opportunity to give you revenue is always a good thing. Once that's complete, once they've created the purchase and they've done and paid you for your service that you're providing or your physical goods or whatever it may be, on the Stripe side, you get lots of really interesting things too. So if you're familiar with Stripe, you might be familiar with the dashboard where there's loads of information about customers' purchases, how they purchased, logs about transaction types and what payment methods they're used. If things go wrong, there's ways to respond and reply to that. And then you can do all kinds of automations on the back end, like connected to a CRM system so that you can follow up with them on their purchase or email them an invoice or a receipt or whatever makes sense for them. All of those automations are way, way easier because of the way that Stripe systems are set up. And so if you're familiar, if you have a business that's already run on Stripe, you can kind of just plug into that stuff directly. And if this is something that is sort of a new venture, then it's worth looking into some of the things that Stripe does and the partners that Stripe works with for things like Stripe apps and all those things that add lots of value on top of your dashboard to begin with. It's not to say you can't get those things done through the Apple Store and through the Google Play Store, but it's just a little bit less friction as the person sort of running the show and developing the app there as well. So I think with that, maybe we can go into a bit of a demo here, Jan. Do you want to show us a little bit of React Native?
Sure.
That's great. Let me get the screen share set up here.
Okay, so maybe quickly we will reiterate the Expo. So you can go to Expo site, and usually when you install all required tools to create a React Native app, you will have to just run a single command, open your folder, and then you're good to go. And then you can use Visual Studio Code or any other editor that you might be familiar with and start working on your app. And when you want to integrate with Stripe, the only thing that you will need to do is to run npm install, and that's all. And if you look at the code, it's very much the same as with React. You will notice that instead of divs, spans, and other HTML components, you will have view, text, status bar, and so on. and below you will see that styling looks a lot like CSS in JS, and you will see that the names are basically the same as in CSS, and it's easy to discover and work with, even though it's a bit different experience. And if we go and see Stripe example app, you will see that I have opened iOS and Android emulator, and you will have a lot of options to control this device. So even if you don't have access for specific device, you can still do testing. So for example, you will also have access to dev tools and debug tools. So you will be able to go and check elements just as you can on web. Yeah, I think then you will also notice that the apps, even though they are written, that there is single code base and single component that is used on both of these devices, they don't look exactly the same. And it's on purpose. The goal of React Native is not to make your app look exactly the same on every device, but to make it look as it would, as it's intended for this specific platform. So for example, if you want to accept a payment, you will be able to go through and check out. And here you will see that you have Apple Pay and also something that is exclusive for iOS is an option to scan card. And I think my Android emulator just crashed. So let me maybe restart it. And here you can also see that when you start your application, you will have all logs and info on what's going on in your app. And let me try again.
Yeah, I'll point out a few things while you're getting that running again, Jan. So this is the exact same code base being deployed to two different emulators. So this is the the iOS emulator on the left with the iPhone, and the Android emulator on the right. It is entirely the same code without modification running on the two. And so showing the two demos right next to each other is really kind of a helpful visual for teams that maybe were in a place where they know they need a mobile app, and we're sort of making the decision between, do I need to spin up an iOS dev team using Swift and an Android dev team using Kotlin? If your team is already building with React, this might be a viable option where you can sort of build it in one place and deploy to both phone ecosystems at the same time. Should also probably point out too that React Native compiles to the web as well. So if you were starting truly from scratch with a web interface, you could also deploy your website using this and have the same code base. Like we mentioned before, I think Twitter does that too.
Yes, the Twitter main app and main website is written in React Native Web. So it's quite a good example that it's doable and it works even on such a big scale. And here I was Android emulator is working for me now. So you will see that even though I opened the same view screen, and there are some differences. So whether it's fonts or some features. So for example, Apple Pay is only available on iOS, and the option to scan card, and you won't see it here, but the code under the hood is the same. I will show it in a minute. Yeah, even things like pop-ups are native to the platform. So you will see that even though we show the same message, it looks different on iOS and Android.
Yeah, from a user experience standpoint, the benefit of that is really subtle, but it'll just feel like it should to the people on each individual phone.
Yes.
And almost to an extent, if they're not noticing it, it's a good thing that it just feels like it should, and it's sort of familiar with all the rest of their experience using their Android phone, for example.
Yeah. So here, for example, you will also have Apple Pay and so on, and here you won't see it. And if you want to show something or hide something for a specific platform, it's very easy to do. So here, if we are looking at the code for home screen, and the only thing that you need to do is check the platform, and if it's iOS, show something. If not, you won't show it. And as you can see, we have TypeScript support, so you will see that what platforms we can check for. And here we have Android, iOS, macOS, and web and Windows. So this is really cool. Here we have also styles applied for a specific container, and we have button container, which has the styles that are very easy to understand and implement. And here's a screen that we've looked first, and as you can see, it's a standard React component. You have hooks, you have use state, you have normal functions and use effect. So even though there are small differences, it should be quite easy to pick up for anyone who's familiar with React Web.
Yeah, I'm hoping by now all of our friends who are only web developers so far are heaving a sigh of relief that this looks so familiar. And truly, it's not that hard to get set up and start building your React Native apps. It's really interesting. Jan, can you maybe show some of the difference between style sheets in React Native and CSS on the web?
Okay, so let me look up an example. Let me think about it. So here we also have something like Snack. This is very similar to Code Sandbox or Stack Blitz. When you want to,
sorry to interrupt. Can you zoom in on that a little bit?
Sure, I'll try.
That's great.
Okay, great. So here you can even test on real devices, because Snack has emulators running on the servers, so you don't even have to set up anything on your computer to maybe try something out. And can you repeat the question about styles? Like
so I'm interested in seeing. So we, like on the web, we sort of talked about there's lots of different ways to set a display property, for example, where you have block and inline block and all those things, and it's a lot simpler on React Native,
yes.
right?
Oh, okay. So maybe let's go back here. So here you will see that there are not as many options for display as on web. So for example, every component in React Native has display flex, so it's much easier to make components flow and be responsive. And yeah, I think that you can also use TypeScript or even in your JavaScript project to see what options are available.
Yeah, that's great. And this is a good example here too. Like, this is really nice TypeScript autocomplete here. And if you used JS in CSS before in your React apps, all this should look pretty familiar. The syntax is pretty close to CSS, and close enough that probably without even going to look much up, you can use just the TypeScript autocomplete to figure out what you need to do. And Flex, the Flex display here follows pretty closely with Flexbox on the web. So it gets pretty familiar and feels pretty nice once you kind of get into the flow of doing it. It's a really, really helpful setup.
Yeah.
Am I right in saying as well that like the set of styles that are available to you, but like, am I right in saying that they still compile down into like into layouts that are compliant with the UI guidelines for each platform?
Yes, you could say that. So
that's cool.
You will see something that is specific for the platform, but I haven't had any issues that what I was writing was something else that and it wasn't exactly the thing that I had in mind. So, and even though the overall styling API is much slimmer compared to CSS, it's not very limiting. And if you need more power, you can use additional animation libraries like Reanimated, where you can do a lot of cool stuff that is sometimes very hard to replicate on web.
Yeah, super cool. Sorry, Mike, I put it on you there a little bit.
Yeah, no, not to worry. So I think it's really interesting kind of just to show these sort of basic examples, because even just going back to the emulator view there, we're showing a fairly simple setup with these Stripe demos, but even like the payment sheets that Jan pulled up before are lightly customized. So if you want to have your theme applied on top of it, you can have something that looks native, but also has a bit of your company's flair, your app's flair into it, that deploys across these things in a way that's sort of sensible. For all the other sort of interface bits that you're building, you can really customize to your heart's content. But what React Native gives you and what Expo gives you is a really, really great starting point to build interfaces that work well, that are device specific in ways that are intelligent. So things like a phone number form will pop up the keyboard on your phone, the touchscreen keyboard that only shows digits, numerals, right, 0 through 9. And you can do email addresses and things like that in the same way that you would do for a web interface, but it works with the native interface on the phone, and it feels really great to do that. It's very helpful to have that sort of in your quiver as you're building these things, because setting up the time to do that by hand with a web app certainly would be quite the process, even if you're interested in building a progressive web app. But then going the native route means you need to build an app for every platform you want to support. And so React Native kind of bridges all of those things. And the Stripe React Native library gives you lots and lots of payment options and all the good things that Stripe provides as well.
Yeah, so here I just open an example of card input where you have like a placeholder and information what you need to type in. So it's validated and it shows exactly what you need to type in to go through and make a payment.
Yeah, that's great. And that's one of those subtle things that really is ends up being a very nice user experience that I don't know, as it compares to the other alternative of having like the full keyboard displayed and having to figure out how to change that to display just what you want, is a massive shortcut to productivity. You can get a lot of things done very quickly using some of these pre-built components too. Yeah, okay, so I see we're kind of getting up to sort of the end of the hour here. I want to make sure we leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. I know we have a handful of folks who are in chat here who might have some questions. If you have questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat. We'll save a couple of minutes at the end here. Jan, well, I guess I should say, is there anything else that you wanted to showcase and kind of demonstrate? And if we're through demos and there's sort of nothing else you wanted to cover, I'd love to hear a little bit about what's going on at CallStack, what you're working on, and some of the other things that you might want to share with the world here.
Sure. So I think I showed everything that I wanted, but if there are any questions, I'll try to show a quick example. And at CallStack, we are developing a lot of open source projects. Our developers contribute to React Native Core, and we are also developing component library React Native Paper. Our developers also contribute to the most.
Oops. I lost you on my side. Sorry, I think I lost you for a second there, Jan. Do you mind repeating the last sentence or two?
Sure. So so we are developing a React Native paper, which is a component library for React Native. We are also developing the most popular React router, which is React Navigation. Our team contributes to React Native Core, and we have lots of smaller projects. Also, people who might be familiar with testing React apps and React testing library, we are also developing React Native testing library, which implements very similar API for testing React Native apps.
Cool. One thing I'm interested in is, apart from the React Native dev website, like what are your favorite resources for starting out and kind of keeping your keeping up to date with React Native, but more from a getting started perspective, maybe?
I think YouTube is a great source. And what else? Let me look for it. The anime, because yeah. So for React Reanimated, there is a great series on YouTube where you can learn more about it. I think also going through official documentation for specific libraries, and also I think there is awesome React Native repository where you can look through what's available and what are the best practices. I also like to follow a lot of people on Twitter where they share their best practices and thoughts, and this is a good way to pick up some small bits and pieces on what are the best practices. And I think that that's all that I'm usually using. I like to go through different blog posts and learn specific parts that maybe I'm working on or I'm interested in.
Cool. Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll give another shout just to sort of reaffirm this, that our friends at CallStack are super helpful whenever I'm running into trouble. It's kind of one of the first places I turn. And Jan, you're definitely one of those people that I consider the expert in the field. So I would suggest strongly, if you're watching this, to go and follow Jan on Twitter and CallStack as well. I'll drop CallStack's information on the stream here again. Please do check it out, and if you have any questions or thoughts or demos you're interested in seeing, all that, CallStack really are the experts on the scene there. If anyone has any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll hang out for another couple of minutes here and maybe talk shop for a little bit, but if there are no questions, we'll end in maybe a minute or two. Yeah, sort of beyond that, Jan, I'm kind of interested in what you think is big coming for React Native. What do you think are some of the changes that you're eager to see maybe built into the core library or in Expo or things like that that'll make life easier?
Sure. So recently, new architecture for React Native was published, and also documentation for it, because Facebook is using it for nearly two years, but they were refining it and testing on their own projects. So a lot of libraries are right now rewriting to the new architecture, which should give quite nice performance boost for specific cases. And yeah, I think that's something that is the biggest thing that I'm excited about, but also overall it allows other platforms integrate much easier, because right now the bindings between React Native and specific platform had to be implementing for each platform, and now the big part is written in C++, so it can be reused everywhere, and then only a small layer of bindings is needed for a specific platform. So we probably will see more platforms and better integrations in the future. And overall, I think the dev experience in the last 2 years has improved tremendously. And I think going into the future, even more stuff will be coming, because like recently, moving the official TypeScript types into the main repository will make sure that they are up to date and then they are well written.
Yeah, I've been a part of a couple of different React Native dev teams in the past, and that's a point that can't be emphasized enough. I think the React Native team, and especially the Expo team, have done a really incredible job of spending their time on things that are high impact and have been super, super helpful for the developer experience. It's come leaps and bounds in a way that is sort of hard to believe, the dev experience for building with React Native, and it's really cool. And I think if you're watching this and you've built with React Native before and felt discouraged for whatever reason, it's definitely worth a look again whenever you get the chance to, for sure. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat here, and I think with that, maybe it's time for us to sign off. Jan, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. It was really nice chatting with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. See you soon.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And that's it for us. So thanks for tuning into Dev Chats, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.